The man who once bit the head off a bat in front of thousands of screaming fans chose to leave this world in complete silence. No pyrotechnics, no leather pants, no theatrical chaos. Just the gentle sound of wind through oak trees at his private countryside estate, where Ozzy Osbourne was laid to rest in what might be the most shocking plot twist in rock and roll history.
Disease crushed me. During the 3 months after the surgery, I was almost a useless person.
You see, while the world expected a funeral that would make headlines for decades, what actually happened was something so intimate, so quietly powerful, that it reveals a side of Ozzy that most people never knew existed. And here's the thing that's going to blow your mind: this wasn't a last-minute decision. This was planned. This was intentional. This was the real Ozzy Osbourne finally showing the world who he truly was beneath all that madness.
Having that surgery, but no one told me at the time that keeping it as it is might be better. It's not those doctors who keep me alive.
Let me paint you a picture of where this all went down. We're not talking about some Hollywood cemetery or Westminster Abbey. We're talking about a 250-acre estate tucked deep in the English countryside of Buckinghamshire, where Ozzy had been quietly transforming himself for years. This place wasn't just a house, it was his sanctuary. The place where the Prince of Darkness became John Michael Osbourne again. And here's what nobody talks about. Ozzy bought this estate not for the prestige, not for the status symbol, but because he was running. Running from the industry that nearly killed him. Running from the addiction that almost destroyed his family. Running from the character he'd created that had become a prison. Out there, surrounded by nothing but rolling hills and ancient trees, he found something he'd been searching for his entire life: peace. Sharon once said in a private interview that she watched Ozzy physically change when they moved to the countryside.
Doctors who keep me alive, but Sharon, that woman who supported my messy life, she knew how terrible I was when I was young. She should have dumped me countless times.
The man who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes suddenly spent hours by the lake, just watching the water. The guy who lived on chaos started feeding ducks every morning at exactly 7 a.m. He planted a garden with his own hands that had gripped microphones in front of millions, now tenderly caring for roses and herbs. But here's the part that's going to hit you right in the chest. Ozzy knew this is where he wanted to be buried long before anyone realized he was dying.
I'm dying. It's a fact. There's no need for a doctor to tell me. That farewell performance was something I insisted on doing.
3 years ago, during one of his health scares, he took Sharon on a walk around the property and pointed to a spot overlooking the lake. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "When my time comes, I want to rest right there. Not in some fancy mausoleum where people come to gawk. Right there where I learned how to be human again." The transformation wasn't just about location, it was about identity. The same man who once snorted a line of ants became someone who couldn't kill a spider in the house. He'd catch them in a glass and release them outside. The guy who trashed hotel rooms started leaving books of poetry on his nightstand. Black Sabbath's vocalist began every morning not with Jack Daniels, but with tea and toast, sitting in his pajamas, reading the newspaper like any other grandfather. And that's the secret nobody saw coming. Ozzy's greatest performance wasn't on any stage. It was this quiet, decades-long transformation from chaos to contentment, from destruction to redemption, from performer to person. The countryside estate wasn't just where he lived his final years, it was where he discovered who he actually was when nobody was watching. This is why the private ceremony hits so differently. When you understand that this property represented his journey from darkness to light, from addiction to sobriety, from spectacle to sincerity, then you realize that choosing to be buried there wasn't just about privacy. It was about coming full circle. It was about the most honest thing Ozzy Osbourne ever did. The man who built his career on shocking people delivered his final shock by doing the exact opposite of what everyone expected. No circus, no media frenzy, no grand finale, just a quiet gathering of the people who knew the real him in the place where he'd finally learned to live without performing. And as we're about to discover, what happened at that ceremony, who showed up, and what they said will change everything you thought you knew about the Prince of Darkness. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with volume. It's made with the courage to be vulnerable, to be real, and to let the people you love see you exactly as you are. The silence spoke louder than any scream ever could. What happened under those white tents on that quiet afternoon would have reduced even the toughest rock critics to tears. Because this wasn't just a funeral. This was 40 years of love, pain, redemption, and raw human connection distilled into 2 hours that nobody who was there will ever forget. The ceremony began at exactly 3 in the afternoon, not with a priest or a formal eulogy, but with something that caught everyone off guard. A member of Ozzy's road crew, a guy who'd been with him since the 80s, stepped forward and started talking about a night in 1992. Backstage, after a massive show, this crew member found Ozzy crying in his dressing room. Not from exhaustion, not from the high of performance, but from genuine fear that he didn't deserve any of the love the crowd had just shown him. That's who they were really burying, not the myth, but the man who carried that vulnerability his entire life. But here's where it gets absolutely heartbreaking. Sharon had prepared remarks, obviously. 40 years of marriage, you'd expect a long, emotional speech. Instead, she walked to the front of that small gathering, looked out at faces she'd known for decades, and said just 7 words that shattered everyone present. He always told me he wanted to go home. Now he has. That was it, 7 words. But the way she said them, the weight behind them, the lifetime of understanding packed into that simple statement, grown men who'd shared stages with Ozzy were openly weeping. Because everyone there knew what home meant to him. It wasn't Birmingham. It wasn't the mansion in Beverly Hills. It was this place, this piece, this version of himself he'd fought so hard to find. And then the guest list started revealing itself, and let me tell you, nobody expected this. Elton John had flown in from Monaco. James Hetfield from Metallica was there, standing next to Geezer Butler like they were old friends instead of legends. Corey Taylor made the trip from the States. Even Paul McCartney had sent a personal letter that was read aloud before the guests arrived. But here's the moment that broke everyone, and I mean everyone. They'd set up a simple sound system, nothing fancy. Someone started playing an acoustic version of Dreamer, but it wasn't a recording. It was live, sung by one of Ozzy's young relatives, maybe 16 years old, with a voice that cracked with emotion on every line. Halfway through, her voice gave out completely, and instead of stopping, the entire gathering, these rock legends, these tough-as-nails industry veterans, they all started humming the melody together. No words, just this haunting, beautiful hum that carried across the water. And in that moment, you could feel Ozzy there with them. Not gone, but transformed into something bigger than any one person could contain. Then came the surprise that nobody saw coming. Hidden speakers around the property crackled to life with a recording, not of Ozzy singing, but of him talking to a crowd years earlier. His voice, raw and honest, saying, "I don't know how I got here, but I know one thing, I love you all, and I never took it for granted, not for a second." The timing wasn't planned. Someone had secretly added it to the playlist, and when his voice filled the air, you could hear people catching their breath, trying to hold themselves together. Zakk Wylde, Ozzy's longtime guitarist and practically a son to him, had been silent the entire time. But when that recording played, he walked over to where they'd placed Ozzy's favorite guitar, the one he'd played at home, not on stage, and just stood there with his hand on it, lips moving in what looked like a private conversation with his mentor. The music continued in waves throughout the afternoon. Not his greatest hits, not the songs that made him famous, but the quiet ones, the deep cuts, the songs he'd written about love, about loss, about finding yourself when you're completely lost. Each song was chosen by someone who knew what it meant to him personally, and the selections painted a picture of Ozzy that the public rarely saw: thoughtful, spiritual, deeply connected to the people who mattered most. What made this ceremony so powerful wasn't the celebrity presence or the perfect setting. It was the absolute authenticity of it. These weren't people performing grief for cameras. This was real loss, real love, real recognition that they'd shared something extraordinary with someone who could never be replaced. By the time the last note faded, there wasn't a dry eye in that gathering, because they weren't just saying goodbye to Ozzy Osbourne, rock legend. They were saying goodbye to a husband, father, friend, and mentor who had somehow managed to find his way home. While the elite mourned behind gates and hedges, something absolutely incredible was happening 90 miles away in Birmingham. And what the people of Ozzy's hometown did spontaneously will restore your faith in humanity and show you the real measure of his impact on ordinary lives. It started at the Black Sabbath bench by the canal, you know, that simple memorial they put up years ago. But by the afternoon of his funeral, it had transformed into something magical. Someone had laid down a worn leather jacket and scrawled across it in white marker, "Thank you for saving my teenage years." Around it, candles flickered next to old vinyl records, concert tickets from shows 30 years ago, and handwritten notes that would break your heart. These weren't organized tributes or corporate displays. These were personal artifacts from people's lives. A teenager had left his first guitar pick with a note saying Ozzy taught him it was okay to be different. A middle-aged woman placed a hospital bracelet next to a photo, explaining how "Mama, I'm coming home" got her through cancer treatment. Each item told a story of how this man's voice had reached into someone's darkest moment and pulled them through. But here's what gets me. There was no social media campaign, no official announcement, no organization behind this. Word just spread organically through the city. By evening, thousands of people had gathered at multiple locations across Birmingham. The Black Sabbath Bridge became a shrine of flowers tied to the rails, with lyrics spray-painted underneath that had transformed from graffiti into gospel. At one point, a young man with a beat-up speaker started playing "Mama, I'm Coming Home," and something beautiful happened. Strangers started gathering around him. Some sang along, some just listened, some cried openly. But they were all connected by this shared understanding that they'd lost someone who mattered. Not because they knew him personally, but because his music had been the soundtrack to their struggles, their victories, their most human moments. The most powerful scene happened near the original Black Sabbath rehearsal spaces. An elderly woman, maybe in her 70s, stood holding a faded photograph of teenage Ozzy from the early 70s. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't perform her grief for attention. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, clutching that photo like it was a piece of her own history. Because for her generation, Ozzy wasn't just entertainment. He was rebellion, freedom, the voice that said it was okay to be angry, to be different, to refuse to fit in. The beautiful thing was watching the generations mix. Old punks with faded tattoos stood next to teenagers discovering his music for the first time. Fathers brought their daughters to explain who Ozzy was and why his voice had mattered to them growing up. Grandparents pointed to the memorials and told wide-eyed grandchildren stories about a time when music was dangerous, when it meant something, when a working-class kid from Aston could change the world just by refusing to be quiet. This wasn't just nostalgia or celebrity worship. This was something deeper. These people understood that Ozzy represented something they were losing: authenticity in a manufactured world, rawness in a polished age, the courage to be broken and beautiful at the same time. His music had given them permission to feel everything: rage, pain, joy, hope, without apology. By nightfall, the impromptu memorial had spread across the entire city center. People were sharing stories, playing music from their phones, lighting candles, leaving messages. A few local musicians set up acoustic guitars and started playing Black Sabbath songs stripped down to their emotional core. The same riffs that once shook stadiums now whispered through the streets where they were born. What Birmingham did that day proved something that no chart position or platinum record ever could: that Ozzy's real legacy wasn't in the industry metrics or the headlines. It was in the hearts of ordinary people who felt less alone because of his voice. People who found strength in his vulnerability, hope in his recovery, courage in his refusal to pretend everything was fine. The working-class hero had come home, carried not by limousines or industry executives, but by the love of people who understood that sometimes the most important voices come from the most unlikely places. Birmingham didn't just remember Ozzy Osbourne that day. They celebrated the part of themselves that his music had awakened. Here's the truth that's going to hit you like a lightning bolt. Ozzy's decision to exit quietly wasn't surrender. It was the most punk rock thing he could have possibly done. In a world obsessed with viral moments and manufactured drama, choosing silence over spectacle was the ultimate rebellion. He flipped the script one final time, and in doing so, redefined what it actually means to be a legend. Think about it, everyone expected the circus, the media frenzy, the over-the-top farewell that would dominate headlines for weeks. Instead, he gave them nothing to exploit, no drama to sensationalize, no chaos to commodify. By choosing that quiet ceremony at his countryside estate, Ozzy took back control of his own narrative in the most powerful way possible. He made it about love instead of entertainment. And that estate, that beautiful, peaceful sanctuary where he spent his final years, represents something profound about redemption and second chances. This was the same man who once urinated on the Alamo, who lived on a steady diet of drugs and Jack Daniels, who seemed destined to burn out in spectacular fashion. But instead of becoming another cautionary tale, he became something much more powerful: proof that people can change, that recovery is possible, that even the most lost souls can find their way home. The contrast between his wild past and peaceful ending isn't a contradiction, its completion. Every mistake, every excess, every moment of chaos led him to that quiet place by the lake where he finally understood who he was when nobody was watching. The countryside estate wasn't just where he chose to be buried. It was where he chose to live authentically for the first time in his life. But here's what makes his legacy truly immortal. It's not just about the music, though the music will live forever. It's about permission. Ozzy gave multiple generations permission to be messy, to be imperfect, to struggle publicly and still be worthy of love. His vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was revolutionary. In an industry built on fake perfection, he showed up authentically broken and somehow made that beautiful. His greatest rebellion wasn't against authority or musical conventions. It was against the idea that people can't change, that addicts can't recover, that broken families can't heal, that working-class kids can't reshape the world. Every time someone chooses recovery over destruction, authenticity over performance, family over fame, they're living out part of Ozzy's legacy. And Sharon, watching her navigate that ceremony with such grace and strength, showed us something else about his impact. Their marriage survived scandal, addiction, public humiliation, and decades in the spotlight because underneath all the madness was genuine love. Not perfect love, but real love. The kind that chooses to stay, to fight, to rebuild when everything falls apart. That's a legacy that goes far beyond music. The spontaneous memorial in Birmingham proved that his influence reaches places the industry can't measure. Those weren't fans mourning a celebrity. They were people honoring someone who had been part of their most intimate moments. The soundtrack to their pain and healing. The voice that said it's okay to be angry, to be scared, to be human in all its messy complexity. This is why that quiet ending was so brilliant. Ozzy understood that the most powerful statements aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes revolution comes through transformation. Sometimes the biggest impact happens when you choose peace over chaos, family over fame, authenticity over performance. The Prince of Darkness didn't fade into darkness at all. He became light, the kind that comes from hard-won wisdom, from battles fought and won, from a life lived fully and honestly. That light doesn't dim when the person is gone. It spreads, it multiplies, it inspires others to find their own path from chaos to peace. He screamed to wake the world up and left it more awake than he found it. The thunder may have stopped, but the echo is eternal. What's your favorite Ozzy memory? Was it a song that got you through tough times, a concert that changed your life, or just his fearless authenticity that inspired you? Share your story in the comments below. Let's keep his spirit alive through the memories he gave us. And hit subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends we love.